Good evening, my name is Juan Manuel Rullo. I'm a Colombian historian, and today I'm going to talk to you about the armed conflict in Colombia. I'm only going to give you a summary of my actual lecture, and the title of it is Armed Conflict in Colombia Between Legitimacy and Violence. It is not an actual title of mine, it is from another historian called Marco Palacio. He has a book about the armed conflict in Colombia with this title, Between Legitimacy and Violence, although I take it from him because I do believe that it shows the main problems of political legitimacy from the one hand and violence in Colombia. I'm only going to give you in this podcast a summary of the lecture, which is going to focus mainly in the problem of violence during the 20th century from the 1950s onward. So what we have to keep in mind is that the armed conflict in Colombia is extremely complex. And the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that we cannot see the armed conflict in Colombia either as the righteous state against the murderous rebels or as the Robin Hoods against the corrupt state. It is a combination of factors that makes the armed conflict in Colombia much more complex than that. It is a combination of different actors between the communist guerrillas, paramilitary groups, drug dealing cartels, and of course the state. And it has affected large parts of the population. It has influenced the political sphere and the political establishment. It has led to terrorist attacks in the cities and in the countryside, to massacres and internal displacement. Now, when we talk about the causes of the conflict, we can recognize 5 main causes. The first one, of course, is poverty. Poverty has been an issue in Colombia pretty much since in all of our Republican history, and is one of the elements that has fueled the conflict. Poverty in the cities, but mainly in the countryside, and the problem of inequality in the distribution of the land. A second problem is a culture of violence as a way of making and enforcing policy that has pretty much been part of the political establishment since the 19th century. Third, lack of state legitimacy and presence. One of the problems that the Colombian state has had for a long time is that it has not been able to make actual presence in all of the national territory, and in many of these places, in many of these parts, illegal groups have substituted the state. Fourth, inequality in the countryside and in the cities. This point is important because drug dealing has become a way of getting out of poverty for a lot of poor people in the cities. Of course, poor people that either end in jail or end dead, but has helped to fuel the violence in the country. And fifth, the lack of guarantees for political participation for some parts of the population, like the communist guerrillas. Now, when we talk about the phases of the violence in Colombia, we can have several phases, some 7 phases. The first one is the 19th century civil wars. A second one is a relative peace between 1902 and 1940s. The third one is the violence with capital V from 1946 to 1958. A fourth one is the appearance of the guerrillas and the National Front from 1958 to 1974. Then we have the guerrillas and the paramilitary groups with drug lords from 1974 to 2002. Next, we have the paramilitary expansion and guerrilla weakening from 2002 to 2008. And finally, the peace process that began in 2012 under the presidency of Juan Manuel Santos. However, we are only going to focus from the period of the 1950s onward, pretty much. So what we have to keep in mind is that the current armed conflict that we have in Colombia is the result of the bipartisan violence that characterized Colombian politics from the beginning of the 19th century. The two main political parties, the conservatives and the liberals, fought a series of civil wars in the 19th century. After the war from 1899 to 1902, there was an agreement between the two governments not to use open violence as a way of making policy. And from 1902 to 1940s, we have conservative governments that are ruled by only conservative politicians, or liberal governments that are ruled only by liberal politicians. However, this changes around around 1946. The key figure here is a liberal politician called Jorge Eliezer Gaitán. He was a liberal, he was a populist, he appealed to the people, and he had left-wing ideals. He was promoting an agrarian reform in order to solve the problems of inequality in the countryside. Colombia, since pretty much the period of the independence, has had a huge problem of huge landowners that have a lot of land and small farmers that pretty much have no land. So there's a big problem of inequality in the country. Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was one of these politicians really popular with the masses, not really members of the elite or the political establishment of the early 20th century. However, the problem with him is that Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was assassinated the 8th of April of 1948 in the city of Bogota. This led to massive riots in the city called El Bogotazo during the 8th and 9th of April of 1948. And what we have to keep in mind is that in Colombia in the 1940s, 1930s, 1950s, political identity was much more important than national identity. People first understood themselves as liberals or as conservatives, and then as Colombians as a whole. With this in mind, the assassination of Gaitán exacerbated these particular identities of the people and faced conservatives against the liberals. What do I mean? Liberals started to blame conservatives for the assassination of Gaitán. Conservatives started to blame liberal elites for the assassination of Gaitán, and as people from the two sides started to face each other, violence not only erupted in the city, it also erupted in the countryside. So the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitán and the incrimination of both political parties led to an open state of general violence in Colombia between groups identified either with the Conservative Party, which were normally paramilitary groups, or the Liberal Party, which were to form liberal guerrillas. This exacerbated the problems regarding the public order around the country and led to authoritarian reactions in the government. In 1946, then, is when begins the period that is called the violence, with a capital V. It's an unofficial state of civil war in which conservative paramilitary groups, members of the army, are fighting liberal guerrillas in the countryside in several regions of the country. What we have to keep in mind, however, is that these two groups were actually supported by both political parties, although not in an official way. What do I mean? Both political parties were either giving resources to these groups or were fomenting them underneath the table, to put it that way. Although in public speeches, no political party would actually say that they supported either the liberal guerrillas or the conservative paramilitary groups. This is going to be important by the moment that FARC appears. And as I said, it led to authoritarian reaction from the government. A good example is Laureano Gómez, a conservative politician really close ideologically to Franco's Spain, and he was one of the conservatives that led the most violent reaction against liberal guerrillas, which again helped to fuel the violence in the country. However, by 1953, both conservatives and liberal elites realized that the violence was getting out of control. So the solution to this problem was to name a dictator that was to be supported by both political parties. This dictator was to be General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. Colombia, in that sense, might be a little bit different from other Latin American countries. Colombia is the only country that has not really had a large dictatorship. Gustavo Rojas Pinilla only lasted 4 years in power, hardly a long-term dictator. But he was supported by both parties with the mission of pacifying the country, which he was successful at doing at the beginning of his presidency. Many of the liberal guerrillas, well, not many, some of the liberal guerrillas in Tolima or in the flatlands, in the eastern flatlands, actually demobilized during the early years of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla government, presidency. However, Of course, as it happens with dictators, Gustavo Rojas Pinilla said that he would renounce power once the constitutional order was again safe. And as years started to pass, the constitutional order was never really safe. Also, by the end of his presidency, guerrilla groups were starting to appear again. So liberals and conservatives in 1957 got together to kick Gustavo Rojas Pinilla out of power, and they came with an idea, a pact between the two parties in order to end the bipartisan violence. This is the period that we call the National Front, from 1958 to 1974. So as the violence in the country could not be stopped by Rojas' dictatorship, and seeing that he was not willing to relinquish control of the government, both political parties, with a massive popular support, demanded the resignation of the general and established the National Front, a bipartisan agreement to stop the violence. What was this bipartisan agreement about? It was to take the state and divide it in half between conservatives and liberals. The Congress was to be divided in half, the House of Representatives was to be divided in half, governorships, mayorships, and the presidency was to be shifted between the two parties. So 4 years a liberal, 4 years a conservative, 4 years a liberal again, and 4 years a conservative at the end. Again, this was the goal of this policy, was to stop the violence. Finally, in the bipartisan violence had always been about who controlled the government, and the National Front promised to end this violence, and in that regard it was successful. We have 4 presidents: Alberto Lleras Camargo from 1958 to 1962, liberal politician. He's the first member, he's the first president of the National Front, followed by Guillermo León Valencia from 1962 to 1966, conservative politician; Carlos Lleras Restrepo from 1966 to 1970, liberal politician again; and finally Misael Pastrana Borrero from 1966 to 1970. The problem with this was that, as I told you, none of these political parties openly supported these groups. And this became a problem for the liberal guerrillas, who had not demobilized during Gustavo Rojas Pinilla's dictatorship. Among the members of those liberal guerrillas was Manuel Marulanda Vélez, who was to become one of the founders of FARC. This has another problem, and we have to remember that the National Front appears in the climate of the Cold War. And since Colombia was a historical ally of the United States, the persecution of the Communist Party, it had begun in Gustavo Pinilla's dictatorship, but it really took shape under the National Front, since the communists were forbidden from exercising policy. We have to remember that the state is divided between conservatives and liberals. So since the Liberal Party is abandoning all these liberal guerrillas, it is the Communist Party, the one who is going to take their place and is going to start fomenting these guerrilla groups. These are Leninist communist ideologists who are going to start with this idea of the vanguard party and the revolution, and professionals to carry out the revolution, and they're the ones who are going to take on the place that the liberals left after the establishment of the National Front. In the early 1960s, a series of independent republics appeared throughout Colombia. One of them was Marquetalia in Tolima today. And after the attack on Marquetalia on the 18th of May of 1964, the survivors of the attack created FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, a Leninist Marxist guerrilla bound to defend in their own speech, defend the agrarian reform, to fight the inequality both in the cities and in the countries, and bound to take the power of the state in order to carry these radical changes. But FARC is not the only guerrilla that is starting to appear. What we have to keep in mind is that although at the beginning the National Front was successful in stopping the violence, it became highly corrupt, since both conservatives and liberals had an interest of covering between themselves. This led up to a lot of frustration in the public sphere and led to the appearance not only of FARC but of several illegal groups. ELN is one of those groups, Quintin Lame, EPL, etc. But what we have to keep in mind is that during these first years of activity of these groups, they are going to be limited to particular regions of influence without posing a serious threat to the government. However, the delegitimization of the bipartisan agreement, due to the corruption of the system, is going to be eroded by decreasing corruption of the state. A very good example of this was, well, we have to remember that these are countryside guerrillas. They mainly operate in the rural areas, but there is one that is going to be different, and is the M19 movement. The M19 movement was born out of the elections in 1966, in which conservative politician Misael Pastrana Borrero ran against the general Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, who was running for the presidency in a different political party. It is claimed that Misael Pastrana Borrero stole the elections, and many of the supporters of the ex-dictator decided to create the M19 movement when they saw that the government was simply corrupt and they were not allowing any other options of political participation. So the National Front ends in 1974 after the presidency of Misael Pastrana Borrero, and a new stage is going to begin in the history of the armed conflict in Colombia. What we have to keep in mind, well, in order to recap until this moment, we have a country that had been historically divided between conservatives and liberals. That led to huge violence in the 50s, linked to a culture of violence, a way of exercising policy. This led to a dictatorship that was not able to end the violence, then to an agreement between conservatives and liberals that ended the bipartisan policy but excluded all other political options, like the Communist Party, which is going to take advantage of these problems of inequality in the countryside, of lack of state presence, in order to influence the creation of communist guerrillas. One thing that we have to remember also is that many of these communist guerrillas are just the leftovers of the liberal guerrillas of the 1940s and 1950s. So by the 1980s, by the late 1970s, and in the 1980s, a new problem is going to appear, and it's the problem of drug trafficking. The first crops of marijuana appeared in Colombia in the 1970s. Then it is going to change to cocaine production, and it is going to help fuel the armed conflict in Colombia, although not necessarily at the beginning. In the 1980s, of course, appears this famous figure, Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar is like a very good example of poverty linked to drug trafficking, to problems of inequality, and how it fueled the conflict in Colombia. Pablo Escobar was born in Medellin to a poor family. He got into drug trafficking relatively early in his life and was able to create a fortune out of drug trafficking. Now, what is the problem? What is the relationship of this with the armed conflict? That the guerrillas started to kidnap the members of drug trafficking families in order to get rescues and income out of these families. And as a reaction, many of these drug dealing groups started to create paramilitary groups under the argument that they needed these paramilitary groups to defend themselves from the guerrillas. The state was not there to protect their property, so many of these landowners and drug dealers armed their own paramilitary groups in order to face the guerrillas. Paramilitary groups then are born out of drug trafficking and are going to be kept mainly as a drug trafficking organization, and also with a political agenda quoting of counterinsurgents. So hence the 1980s is going to be characterized by an increase in the violence of the armed conflict in the countryside by paramilitary activities, and by huge hits by some guerrilla groups, mainly the M19 movement. The most famous, of course, the attack on the Palace of Justice in 1986. When politicians start to appear to fight the drug trafficking influence, once it is hence definitely declared illegal in Colombia. Many people like Pablo Escobar start assassinating famous politicians. The most famous of all them all was Luis Carlos Galán, a presidential candidate, really popular, assassinated by Pablo Escobar. So what we have to keep in mind is that in the 1980s, the violence is getting out of control. Not necessarily by the guerrillas at this moment, but by the drug lords, mainly Pablo Escobar. Hence, the elections of 1990 were characterized by the growing political tensions in Colombia. After the assassination of notorious political figures by drug lords, the country claimed for the redaction of a new constitution that would be able to give the necessary tools to face the problem by the state. The Constitution of 1991 sought to be more inclusive with large parts of the population and give political participation to groups not belonging to the traditional political parties. Also, the redaction of the Constitution of 1991 was part of a peace process with some guerrilla groups like the EPL, although we still have some small leftovers of this group, but most importantly, the M19 guerrilla. Again, the first years of the 1990s is going to be characterized by the growing violence of drug lords, mainly Pablo Escobar, who was able to attack the state, to put bombs in several cities until he was killed in 1983 by the special group of the police. After the death of Pablo Escobar, the main agenda of the Colombian state is going to be the persecution of drug trafficking and to seek peace with the guerrilla groups. The best example of this was the presidency of Ernesto Samper, who had this scandal of drug trafficking money getting to his campaign. He persecuted the other big cartel, the cartel from Cali, after the death of Pablo Escobar. And the other goal, the negotiation with the guerrillas, is going to be led by President Andrés Pastrana in 1998, from 1998 to 2002. He got elected until this agenda of peace, but the negotiations got bogged down rather quickly. Not only because the guerrillas showed no real intentions of negotiating a true peace, but also because the paramilitaries were growing stronger and stronger and stronger. It is in the last years of the 1990s that the different paramilitary groups get combined into one single structure under Carlos Castaño, the United Self-Defense Units of Colombia, and all of this led to the failure of negotiations with FARC. So the negotiation with FARC between 1998 and 2002 failed for several reasons. First, an agenda that was too vague and broad that was not realistic with the means of the negotiation. Negotiations really never started. The agenda was way too big and way too vague, so there was no really tools of negotiation. Second, negotiations were too public, which meant that every opinion had to be taken into account, not only of the government, not only of the guerrillas, but of the press, civil population, even celebrities got to give their opinions inside of the negotiation, which limited the effectiveness of the negotiation. And third, the government was too permissive with the guerrillas' activities, which didn't seem to show a real compromise to the negotiations. With this crisis at the end of the 1990s, a final phase is going to begin in the early 2000s. And what we have to keep in mind is that Álvaro Uribe, who got elected in 2002, was the first president in Colombia that did not belong to either a liberal party or the conservative party. And we can explain this rather easily. Ernesto Samper, the president from 1994 to 1998, who had this scandal of money, of drug trafficking money, got into his campaign, was from the Liberal Party, and Andrés Pastrana was a conservative. So after the fiasco of both presidencies, political outsiders seemed rather popular, and Álvaro Uribe got into the presidency with this idea of fighting the guerrillas head-on to recover the legitimacy of the state, to recover the territories controlled by the guerrillas. However, although Uribe was successful in fighting the guerrillas and he rather negotiated with the paramilitaries, what we see from 2002 to 2008 was the incursion of paramilitary structures inside of the political establishment. During these 8 years, 6 to 8 years, a lot of local, regional politicians got elected to the Congress and to governorships that were really not heard of. New political parties, small political parties that suddenly had huge votings, and started to appear. And as it turned out, paramilitary structures started to finance with drug trafficking money many of these politicians, these new political parties, in order to get into the government, force a negotiation that would allow them to demobilize with their fortunes made through drug trafficking. So Uribe's presidency saw a massive increment in the influence of the paramilitary and drug trafficking in Colombian politics. During his 8 years of government, between 1/3 and half of the Congress was linked to paramilitary groups. This phenomenon is called parapolitica in Colombia, who wanted to legalize their condition and fortunes through a negotiation process with the government. This was also met with an increase of the violence activity of paramilitaries who took many of the regions of the guerrillas as they were being defeated by the Colombian government. According to numbers of the vice presidency, at least 40 massacres were committed by the paramilitaries against peasant communities during the Ralito negotiations. The Ralito negotiations was this process in which the government negotiated with paramilitary structures in order to demobilize them, and although they nominally did demobilize, they really did not disappear. They are the now famous criminal bands who operate in some cities and in some regions of the countryside, who continue with these drug trafficking structures that were really not completely eliminated. Finally, what we have today with the weakening of the guerrillas is the negotiations of Juan Manuel Santos with FARC. It is the real first serious attempt to put an ending to the armed conflict with FARC, the longest armed conflict in Colombia. It is not going to be the end of the conflict, but it has advanced rather well, and it seems that the signing of the treaty is inevitable. What we have to keep in mind, however, just to conclude, is that in over 50 years of armed conflict, it is estimated that at least 5 million people have been either a victim of guerrillas, paramilitary groups, or the state through selective murders, massacres, extortion, and forced displacement and disappearance. When we talk about policy and political parties and guerrillas, we normally lose sight of the real victims of the armed conflict, and it has been the civil population, mainly in the countryside. So, to conclude, the armed conflict in Colombia is a rather complex issue. Of course, this is only, again, a summary with really just very broad lines. Right now, the government is negotiating with FARC in order to end to one of the large parts of the armed conflict. They have negotiated the agrarian reform, the problem of drug trafficking, victims, and now we are pretty much on the last part of the negotiation, which would be the demobilization of the guerrillas. And with this, we hope to have a Colombia that is going to be free of violence, or at least not immediately, but in the short length future. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention.